Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/sincerely the suicidal. I think there is a Wendigo in the Minnesota woods. First things first, I wasn't there, but I was the first person he told. This happened in southeast Minnesota. I am not going to be telling the exact location, but it was in a smallish forest on a long bike trail. One more quick thing. It was really windy this day. My friend, who we will call S, and his father were on a bike ride. It was about a 12-mile bike ride. So they are doing their thing when about 5 miles in, S sees what he thinks is a deer. They keep going and S sees a flash of brown next to them in the trees, and it is like this thing is running next to them. Like keeping pace, but he doesn't hear anything. He points it out to his dad, and his father says that it's probably a deer, but he agrees it is really weird, so they keep going. They get to this little beach where they usually rest and look at the river. S notices something feels off. He notices that first of all there is no trees swaying. Secondly, there is no animal noises. Then he realizes he didn't see any animals the whole time they were there. Except the deer. The silence was heavy. It was like every animal left. The woods were silent. S tells his dad that he isn't feeling very well and that he wants to go home. His dad begrudgingly agrees. They get on their bikes and S is almost hyper-aware of his surroundings. They go for a while until S sees a flash of brown again and antlers. They keep going until they hit this clearing. The clearing looks like a big field with trees around it and a bike trail through it. As they enter the clearing, S looks back and there is the fucking beast standing on its hind legs, and he said it was like 9 feet tall. It had antlers and it looked like it had a deer head or some shit. He said he was terrified. They finally got out of the woods and the wind was back and there was animal noises again. I think this was a Wendigo, but I am not sure. I honestly don't know if I believe him, but we are in Minnesota and it wouldn't be impossible, but are we a bit too far south for Wendigos? If you have any ideas or theories, please let me know. Okay, apparently I haven't hit the minimum word count, so I'll give you more minor details. We are pretty much at the bottom of Minnesota. Nowhere close to Rosisu, Minnesota. Like I said, it was really windy this day, like really windy. I think S is kinda sensitive to the paranormal. Just a little bit. Although the Wendigo isn't really paranormal. They have been biking on this trail before. They didn't go the whole way, they went about half. I think it is too short to be a Wendigo. Is it possible it is a skinwalker? I looked on a map and the tribes that were in this area were the Dakota Sioux. This area usually has a lot of wildlife. It was before noon when this happened. He didn't see any other people other than him and his dad. Neither of us know what to think about this. I'll ask him about what it smelled like or if it smelled weird in the area. Second story. This story was shared by you/1inch menace. What does it mean when a Wendigo doesn't attack me? True story. TLDR, I stared a Wendigo in the eyes and it nodded at me before vanishing. Many years ago I had an encounter with a Wendigo. I'm part Cherokee and had heard about these monsters before. It was late at night, I was a teenager. I lived with my family. We had a few dogs and they needed to go outside before bed. One of the dogs would only go in our backyard. One of my family members opened the back door and immediately the dog became aggressive, a dog that had never shown aggression before or after this night. Just as fast as she became aggressive, she became scared and ran back inside. I had just kicked my boots off after wearing them all day and was about to change out of my jeans when this happened. I quickly put my boots back on, grab a flashlight and a large club I had recently made. I book it out to the back of our house and just stop dead in my tracks. I don't see anything, I don't hear anything, but something was there. I could feel the presence of pure evil. Then I see a shadow moving and it's huge. This shadow was easily 8 feet tall, vaguely humanoid but had these massive antlers. Normally my flashlight is able to illuminate everything pretty well. Tonight I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. It was like the light was going into a void. My eyes adjusted to the low light, only starlight letting me see it all. I stand there for what seemed like an eternity as I watch the figure search a workbench before it stops. The figure looks straight forward before turning around to face me. Turning to reveal glowing red eyes. The figure and I stare at each other for what must have been only a moment, but felt like lifetimes. I know that showing fear in this situation is only going to kill me and fighting is a death sentence. But for some reason, I lifted the club and pointed it at the figure. The figure looks at the club and looks back into my eyes before slowly nodding its head up and down a few times. I see my flashlight turn off in my peripheral vision. I look at it and it turns back on, this time illuminating the entirety of the property. I quickly turn my focus back to the figure only for the figure to be gone. What was lifetimes to me was no more than a minute in reality. Third story. This story was shared by you/Theagelstrikes. I know what really killed the old western town of Calico. It came from the mines. My grandfather told me a horrifying story about something that happened in the town of Calico during the dying days of the Wild West. I finally summoned the courage to tell this tale to my grandson, and he insisted that I share it here. I'm not sure that the young boy fully believes me, but he never knew my grandfather. That man was many things, but he did not lie. He could not lie. My name is Elizabeth Langley. I am 82 years old, and I have lived in England for my entire life. I remember, when I was about 8 years old, asking my father about his home. He had a faint American accent, so I knew he had not always lived here. Oakley, California, my father answered. What a place. I miss it. Still, I wouldn't have met your mother if I hadn't moved to England. Why did you move here? Was it the war? I asked. I had always fantasized about America. I longed for the sun-drenched land of California, rather than the bleak remnants of a post-war London. This would have been the year of 1948. I was only a young boy. I must have been no more than 13 years of age when my father packed our bags. As you know, he is a complicated man. He never told me why we were moving. He just said he couldn't do it anymore, my father explained. My curiosity had been piqued. I had expected a simple answer, but my father had only left me with more questions. I knew I had to talk to my grandfather. I had to know more about what happened in America. I think, in hindsight, I would have preferred to live my life without this tale rattling around at the back of my mind. Whether you read ahead is your choice. It's not a story for children, my grandfather told me. Every Christmas, he would come to stay with us. Every Christmas, I pleaded with him to tell me about America. It wasn't until I turned 12 that he finally caved. He realized that I would never stop pestering him, I suppose. My grandfather, Harley, met my grandmother in San Francisco, and they moved to Oakley when my father was born. That didn't answer my question, though. What was so wrong with America? Why did they move to England? There was nothing wrong with Oakley, the dear old man explained to me. There had been nothing wrong with San Francisco, either. What haunted my grandfather was the life he had left behind. He had tried, for years, to flee from it. Nowhere was far enough. Even as he told me this tale, he admitted that traveling to England had never offered the respite he so desperately sought. He said that, perhaps, it was finally time he told somebody his story and lessened the burden. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, my grandfather had been a prospector. He left home at the age of 16, moved from town to town, and eventually settled in Calico, California. Most Americans have probably heard of this western ghost town, but for those readers who don't know about it, the official story about this boom and bust town is that minerals dwindled, as they did in many western towns. The mines dried up. People moved away. However, Harley always insisted that something else happened in Calico. There was another reason that the townsfolk disappeared. It all started in 1895. My grandfather had already been living in Calico for 3 years. He had become a part of the community. He saw himself as more than a prospector. He had even considered settling there. There were a few handsome women in town that he said he would have considered marrying. He had plenty of friends. He enjoyed a drink or two in the saloon. What more could he want from life? Silver was already starting to lose its value, but my grandfather didn't care. He was only 21 years old in the year of 1895, but he was tired. He wanted more from life than mining for valuable resources. And he believed Calico could become more than a mining town. The silver rush didn't have to be the end of it. He believed it could be a place that people would call home. Obviously, that's not how things turned out, but Harley swore that the end of mining was not the thing that killed Calico. In December of 1895, things began to change in the town. People started to go missing. Any search efforts were half-hearted, unfortunately, as the icy nights deterred most people from exerting their full efforts. They wanted to stay indoors. Harley said that a prospector named Lester Grant talked of something he had found down in the mines. A new mineral. Something that would save the mine and, in turn, the people of Calico. Apparently, the prospector claimed it was something he'd never seen before. Perhaps it was even more valuable than silver. My grandfather and his friend laughed it off. They knew, as did everybody in the saloon, that Lester was a drunkard. He was always spouting nonsense to lighten the mood. Lester, as you might have guessed, was the first person to vanish without a trace. Others soon followed. All sorts of townsfolk. Miners, barbers, bartenders, and even one of the sheriff's deputies. That's when things became more serious. 12 people went missing in the first week. When the sheriff's deputy became the 13th to vanish, that's when the search parties became a little more frantic. One evening, when Sheriff Harper was drinking with Harley and his friends in the saloon, he urged them to not let word spread about the disappearances. He didn't want any outside law enforcement to get involved. The sheriff claimed it was just life on the frontier. There were so many possible explanations. Coyotes. Bandits. People smelling the end of the silver rush, perhaps. My grandfather wanted to favor the latter suggestion. Everybody favored that suggestion. It was better to assume that townsfolk had simply moved away, rather than assuming some harm had come to them. Still, Harley was a wise man, and he could not quite shake the feeling that nobody had left Calico. He couldn't stop thinking about what Lester had said. Harley continued to raise the issue in the saloon, night after night. James implored his friend to stop. He needed the mine. He needed the town. Like most people, James was too fixated on the dying days of the frontier to notice anything else. Another week later, after the total number of disappearances totaled 19 people, my grandfather's nightly saloon talk was interrupted. Martha, the bartender, finished her shift and joined Harley and his friends at their table. They immediately offered their condolences. A few days prior, Martha's sister had gone missing. My grandfather said that the bartender's haunted disposition filled him with great unease. She looked not like somebody in the throes of grief, but somebody with a terrible secret. Still, Martha did not stall. She did not mince her words. She said that she had seen her sister. One of the men at the table excitedly roared that they must notify the sheriff. Martha explained that the man did not understand. The previous night, she stood at her upstairs window and gazed out onto the sandy main road that ran through Calico. There, gazing up at her, was her sister. Only, it wasn't her sister. Not really. It was something in her sister's yellow sundress. My grandfather could remember exactly how Martha described the figure. I, too, can remember the exact wording. She painted a nightmarish picture that is permanently etched into my mind. I could scarcely see her in the moonlight, Martha said. My joy was fleeting. I soon realized that she had no discernible facial features. Just a mouth. A gaping mouth, black as the night. She was emaciated, yet so much taller than I remember. Her dress was torn. I could see so little of her, but I could hear her. Didn't you hear that sound last night? It was an inhuman, whistling scream. It sounded like an animal calling to the pack. Of course, most of the men at the table dismissed Martha, claiming that grief had driven her to lunacy. They hadn't heard a scream. They might have heard a few animals, but they heard no inhuman screams. My grandfather said that James simply looked at him with a pale expression. He whispered to Harley that he had heard a blood-curdling scream during the night. He thought he had been dreaming because it was a sound no human could produce, and it was certainly like no animal he had ever encountered. Harley told his friend that he knew who could help. The next morning, he and James did not join their friends in the mines. They traveled southeast, searching for a small tribe of Native Americans that lived towards the town of Yermo. Harley knew a woman named Anjani, one of the elders. Over the years, he had sold various minerals to her from his prospecting ventures in local towns. My grandfather explained to James that Anjani had told him stories of a terrifying creature. The Wendigo. Martha's sister did not match that description, but the encounter sounded like something beyond the realm of logical explanation. The elder had once told my grandfather that there were things which the white colonizers did not understand. If there were anyone who could explain what Martha saw, Harley swore it would be her. When the two men arrived at the tribal village, my grandfather said that Anjani was already expecting him. She told him that something had been unearthed in Calico. It was an ancient thing that should have been left alone. My grandfather said that, 3 years earlier, the old woman cautioned him against prospecting in Calico. She said that land was fragile. Dark things lay there, and those dark things should not have been disturbed. Apparently, James looked even paler than the night before. My grandfather kept encouraging him to drink some water because he didn't want his friend to pass out on the journey back to Calico. And Harley wasn't finished. He needed to know more. He begged Anjani to tell him what was happening to the people of Calico. My grandfather said the elder was far more terrified about this creature than any of the others she had discussed. She said one word, Daiba. It is a creature worse than the Wendigo, she explained to my grandfather. There is a nameless force deep in the earth that calls out to desperate people. It calls to those who need something, much like the residents of Calico who faced the extinction of their livelihoods. Harley inferred that Lester must have felt this force calling to him. There had never been a magical mineral in the mine that would solve all of their problems. Everybody in Calico wanted more. The force must have been calling to all of them. How long, my grandfather wondered, would it be before everyone was gone? Anjani explained that the thirst cannot be quenched until the victim has become a daiva. Then, their mortal desires fade away. Instead, they thirst only for souls, draining the flesh and the spirit of all those who cross their path. The elder said it is a fate worse than death. When the soul is drained, the victim is denied passage to the afterlife. My grandfather heeded her warning and dragged James back out to the horses, preparing to race back to Calico. Before he could leave, however, Anjani grabbed my grandfather's wrist and whispered into his ear. She told him that James had the thirst. She could see it. She begged Harley not to follow his friend into the mines. Harley did not reply. He said James smiled weakly at him before kicking his stirrups and commencing the ride back to Calico. My grandfather did not want to believe it. He couldn't believe it. He wanted to save his friend, but he couldn't lie to himself. He knew that James was already gone. His friend had heard the call of whatever sinister force lay deep in the earth, and his thirst would not be quenched until that call had been answered. As the pair rode back to town, the sun began to set on the horizon. My grandfather said that he felt apprehended by the sudden emergence of Calico on the horizon. Uncharacteristically for that time of night, there was not a single visible light. The town had been engulfed by the night. There was no light, no movement, and no sound. The two men unsaddled themselves and tied their horses to a post. James was shivering at this point, and my grandfather was starting to worry about him. He dipped his head over the doors to the local saloon, peering into the empty building. Nothing. Not a light. Not a sound. Not a person in sight. My grandfather told James that they needed to go straight to the sheriff. Keeping James in his line of sight, Harley led them across the isolated town. When they reached the sheriff's office, they were met with an open doorway. It led into blackness, but there was a kerosene lamp perched on a table in the center of the room. With great trepidation, my grandfather took a few cautious steps inside and called out for the sheriff. There was no response. He tiptoed towards the table in the center of the room, picked up the kerosene lamp, and spun in a circle to get his bearings. What my grandfather said he saw next is something that still chills me to the bone, so I have no idea how horrified he must have felt. It was the sheriff. He was not one of the daiva. He was not anything. The corpse lay on the hard floor, barely visible in the dim light of my grandfather's lamp. The man was a shell. That's how his corpse was described to me. It had been, much as Anjani said, drained both in flesh and spirit. The sheriff had been reduced to little more than bones with bloody strips of flesh remaining. My grandfather said the skull was the worst part of the scene. The sheriff's skin was mostly intact, though gray and colorless, but his eye sockets were empty, and his skull was split roughly down the middle. Harley vomited. I'm not quite sure how he managed to hold his stomach as long as he did, but perhaps, despite his lengthy, detailed description, the whole ordeal only lasted a matter of seconds. Who knows? I did not want to press him on the matter. I was happy for him to move forwards with the story, though things only worsened. When my grandfather left the sheriff's office, James had vanished, much like the rest of the town. Harley called for his friend, but Calico was silent. Nobody responded. Not wanting to leave his loved ones behind, but understanding that the battle had already been lost, my dear old grandfather accepted defeat and began walking back to his horse, preparing to leave Calico behind. He untied his ticket out of that hellhole, mounted the saddle, and then looked back at the town. I still remember my grandfather's face as he reached this part of the story. The sheer horror. He asked me whether we could abandon the tale there. He said I could simply accept that he left Calico, and surely that was enough. But it wasn't. I had to know. I just had to know. There was a whistling scream. I did not need my grandfather to say any more than that. I knew it was the same as the one that both James and Martha had described. That's when my grandfather saw her. Martha. She burst through the saloon doors and sprinted onto the main road, tripping and falling. Presumably, she had been hiding in the building. My grandfather certainly didn't see her when he peered his head inside earlier, but he definitely saw her as she scrambled across the road on her hands and knees. And he saw the creature that followed her from the saloon, ducking as it slinked through the doorway. The Daiba. This one was larger and ghastlier than the sister that Martha had described. From its nondescript shirt and ragged trousers, Harley could not identify which missing town member was stalking the bartender. He said he hardly had time to assess the scene. It was over before it started. The once human creature used its spider-like limbs to move at great speed towards its prey. Moonlight sufficiently illuminated the scene of horror that unfolded before my grandfather. The Daiba lunged for Martha with one of the gnarly appendages that used to be its left hand, and it seized her by the throat. My grandfather said the bartender screeched at the top of her lungs, scratching at the Daiba's left hand with both of hers, and furiously swinging both of her legs back and forth. It was a fruitless endeavor. Harley knew he should avert his gaze. He knew he should ride away and never look back, but he could not peel his eyes from the scene before him. Raising her off the ground, the Daiba moved its right hand towards Martha's face. Suddenly, my grandfather understood what he had seen in the sheriff's office, and he understood what he was about to see. The creature formed a claw shape with its right hand and violently forced its thumb into Martha's right eye socket. My grandfather sobbed profusely as he told me this part of the tale. He said he had never felt so utterly helpless as he did when he watched one of his dearest friends suffer so slowly and agonizingly. Martha's screams grew in volume and ferocity. Harley watched as the creature suspended her in the air with the thumb that had pierced her right eye and released her neck with its left hand. Then, without pause, the Daiba plunged its left thumb into her left eye socket. My grandfather assured me that Martha's screaming rivaled that of the Daiba. It was almost as horrific. Almost. Lifting her body higher into the air, as if she were a trophy, the creature started to yank its hands outwards. Its thumbs were firmly lodged into the bloody sockets that had once been Martha's eyes. Her screeching grew to an unbearable volume. With an almighty tearing noise, the awful sound of Martha's agony ceased. The Daiba stared longingly at the corpse it held in its two hands, and then it began to drink from the canyon it had formed between the two halves of Martha's skull. My grandfather said he uttered a sound. It was involuntary. He had managed to resist the urge to cry or scream, but, at this moment, he gasped. The creature stopped. It turned to face Harley. And that was when it started. What followed was a cacophony of whistling screams. They echoed across the town. Soon, creatures began to reveal themselves from the nooks and crannies of Calico. One of them was wearing a yellow sundress. My grandfather distinctly remembered her. I'm not sure how he made it to his horse, given that everyone else perished. Perhaps the Daiba had been busy feeding when my grandfather first strolled through the town. Perhaps he had been fortunate enough to avoid them. Whatever the case, his luck had run out. His horse had been whinnying uncontrollably since he mounted it, possibly only standing still for so long because it was frozen in the same state of fear as my grandfather. At this point, Harley said his stallion seemed only too happy to oblige when he pulled at its reins and steered towards the road that led out of town. There was, of course, one last demon for my dear old grandfather to face before he could leave Calico behind for good. One last creature stood in the middle of the road to freedom. James. My grandfather said he was not surprised to see the gaping black hole of a mouth and those monstrous limbs, but that didn't make it any less painful to witness. Goodbye, old friend. Those were Harley's final words to James as he plowed onwards, head buried in his horse's mane of hair, charging towards his old friend and preparing for the cold embrace of death. And yet, it didn't come. When my grandfather opened his eyes, he was free. His horse had galloped far beyond the boundaries of Calico. Harley looked over his shoulder to see his old friend standing at the side of the road. He had stepped aside to let my grandfather pass. Perhaps James was not quite as far gone as the others. Perhaps he had retained enough of his humanity to resist the thirst just a little longer. Whatever the case, my grandfather survived to tell the horrible tale. Before moving to San Francisco in 1896, he said he traveled back to Yermo to see Anjani, though he steered clear of Calico. The elder said that some of the Calico townsfolk had survived that unspeakable night by fleeing to the hills. She told my grandfather that the Daiba were not seen again. The tribe assumed that the creatures perished, given that they required continuous sustenance. Once the remaining townsfolk fled, the unnatural beings had no way to quench their thirst. They surely perished. That was the prevailing hypothesis. Other than the few Calico survivors and the people of Anjani's tribe, nobody ever learned of what happened in that town. In fact, Calico lasted for another decade. My grandfather explained that many of the townsfolk returned and tried to squeeze the last few drops of life out of the town before it was officially abandoned in 1907. Sometimes, I wonder whether it was abandoned because the creatures returned. Perhaps some of the fools came back because they thirsted for something. Maybe the mines called to them. Fourth story. The Woods of Kentucky. I just got back from a camping trip on my family's land out in western Kentucky, and I will probably never go back after something stalked us for 2 nights and ultimately made us tear through the dense woods in a panic that cannot be understood until you have been hunted by something that you know is far beyond your comprehension. Something that ancient medicine men and old wives whisper about, throwing glances over aged shoulders to peer into the darkness while leaning forward into the protection of the light of the fire. There were 6 of us out this weekend. Myself and my wife, our super tactical friend Matt, our heavyweight tank of a man friend Sam, my not really a fan of the outdoors friend Jeremy, and his outdoor loving girlfriend Chelsea. For some background, Matt and I are gun nuts, so we were both carrying pistols, even though there isn't really anything in the woods of Kentucky that we need them for. I also had my AR-15 and Matt brought his October 22nd. We arrived at the property at 8 p.m., just as it became pitch black, so we had to make camp in the dark. Not a big deal, just throw on a headlamp and get to setting up camp, starting with the fire. The campsite was a cleared out area, with some trees on the edges, then it gets into the denser woods. Since we had our hammocks, my wife and I had to set up farther away from the fire, which was in the center of the clearing. It was unnerving to see the shadows of our friends, cast by the roaring fire, dance against the trees while we set up our hammocks. We set them up quickly, but due to the general creepiness of the situation, I didn't notice my wife occasionally pausing to look back into the woods and watching for the movement that she later told me she caught out of the corner of her eye. After setting up our camp, I realized that I had left my jacket back in my car, and Matt wanted to go check out a pond nearby, so we decided we would head out together and hit both the cars and the pond. I grabbed my AR and Matt grabbed his October 22nd to go play Mall Ninja in the woods on the way. We handed Sam a radio and made sure we were on the same frequency and headed out. Started out very tactical, but after we got a good distance into the woods, the cars and pond were both in a clearing through about 300 yards of woods, we both were getting a little nervous. I don't think we realized just how dark it was out there. We stopped bounding and covering each other from imagined Chinese paratroopers, and started walking together, rifles down, making as little noise as possible. At first we didn't really know why, but then we stopped and listened. Nothing, absolutely no sounds, no wind, no bugs, nothing. We looked at each other, and even though we couldn't see each other's eyes, we knew what we were thinking. All the damn Inawoods threads on /k/ had prepared us for this moment. We knew what we had to do. I acted first, putting a palm on the back of Matt's neck, and shoved him firmly, simply being able to articulate the word "go" under my breath. He pushed forward through the growth headlong, and I did my best to keep my hand on his back and ignore the thought in the back of my mind, slowly pushing its way forward and filling my chest with terror and rising into my throat. We broke out of the woods into the clearing and made it to the cars, breathing heavily. We both put our backs against my SUV and pointed our rifles into the woods, expecting something to burst after us. After 20 seconds, Matt expressed my thoughts. Something was running behind us, right? I stopped breathing when he said it, because before I had attributed it to my imagination, but a third party now confirmed that something was chasing us, and was now between us and the camp. I called Sam on the radio. "Sam, did anyone else leave camp to follow us?" "Nope, we are all here still." "Shit." I opened the car and reached in to grab my jacket and also got a flashlight while Matt continued staring at the woods, looking for the slightest sign of movement. I turned back around and turned the light on the woods. Nothing, blessed nothingness. But now we had to get back into the woods to get to camp. After 5 minutes to discussing it, we decided that it had just been our imagination, if only just to get the courage to re-enter those haunted woods. Flashlight in hand, I gripped my rifle and slogged in, Matt's hand firmly encouraging me firmly, with him watching behind us. The walk back was uneventful, but at the sight of the fire we hurried our pace even faster before re-entering the safety of the clearing. After we broke out of the woods, we broke formation and quietly agreed under our breath not to mention anything to the group. Silence, unfortunately, seemed to fail, as we were both uncharacteristically quiet. Not to mention that we had not had time to see the pond, and the group was curious about our radio call. So I told them what had happened. 3 chuckled and made fun of 4chan for making up ghost stories, but Chelsea listened intently. Later on she asked if any of us had read the books, Missing 411, or the Native American studies of Dr. George Marlin in his book, Rights of the American Indian. None of us had, but she told us that Missing 411 documented many strange and unexplained disappearances in America, and ROAI is an old, out-of-circulation book she found at the library when she was a kid that confirmed many things that /K/and/X/ said of the occult in the wilderness, more or less. Everyone quieted down at that, and stared into the fire. I remembered reading on /K/ that white ash kills skinwalkers, and since I was a paranoid motherfucker, I thought it might be worth it to dip my hollow points into the white ashes in the fire. Chelsea told me not to bother. It needs to be the ashes of white oak trees per Dr. Marlin. Well damn. My wife spoke up after a few minutes of silence and told us about how she thought she had seen something moving in the woods when we were setting up our hammock. At this point, we were all pretty on edge. Every once in a while we would shine lights into the forest, but never actually saw anything. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. As I lay there in the hammock, I couldn't help but listen to the rustling around our hammock and gripping my MNP tighter and wondering if that sound is really just the wind. The next day was relatively uneventful, and in the midst of the sun and clouds and changing leaves the horror of the previous night was forgotten. We went and shot guns, chopped down a tree to make seats for the campfire, and just enjoyed the cool fall air. However, Instead of shooting all the ammo I brought for the trip, I decided to keep one full mag for my AR and my MNP. Dusk fell and we sat around the fire to cook our hot dogs. Emboldened by the sunlight and full bellies, we taunted the spreading darkness and challenged the spirit of the Wendigo, which unnerved Chelsea, and made me instantly regret my decision. Matt, however, was emboldened, and walked around camp with his rifle slung talking about how he hoped to get to be the first/K/Omando to slay a skinwalker. As the sun finally set, we built up the fire, double-checked our wood supply, and settled in for what we hoped would be a relaxing evening. About an hour after the sunset we had finished making s'mores, when the echoing howls of coyotes started. We were unconcerned, since we know that it is extremely rare for coyotes to attack people, but then the cows in a field in the opposite direction started bellowing as the wind picked up a bit, blowing piles of fallen leaves across camp and bringing into our nostrils the scent of decaying lichen and a touch of rotted meat. Jeremy nervously suggested that perhaps the coyotes had found a kill. Matt, filled with newfound confidence, wanted to go looking for them. I didn't want to go. I really didn't want to go, but I am way too loyal for that shit, so I followed him into the godforsaken woods to look for the coyotes. We moved, slowly and carefully in the direction that we had last heard the coyotes. A mixture of stealth to find the animals, and fear of the unknown. After cruising for about 50 yards, I heard Matt stumble, swear, and fall to the ground, clattering over his plate carrier. I shined my light towards him, and as I looked at what he had stumbled on, the stench or rotting meat and like a dry sewage smell wafted into my nose so that I was doubled over, ready to puke. With hands on my knees and my rifle hanging from its one-point sling, I looked up and saw that my friend had stumbled over a huge deer carcass. He was sitting on his ass just staring at the carcass wide-eyed. I immediately looked up and shouldered my rifle, looking for the coyotes, but they didn't seem to be around. I went over to help Matt up, but when I got over to him he was still staring wide-eyed at the corpse. My view of the body had been from behind, so I didn't see much, just a large deer, but from this side, I could see the horror of the animal. The animal looked both decayed and mutated. The hind legs were huge and muscular, strangely elongated, the chest and body were horribly mutilated, the intestines hanging out like its stomach had been pulled out. The head was the most decayed, I could see the skull in parts and the eyelids had been torn off, the 12-pointed antlers had moss growing all over them. But the worst part was the forelegs. They were long, and slender, and ended in clawed hands. I stared at the creature for a good 5 seconds before I felt the same crushing presence that I had felt the night before, and as I looked around to identify the source, I realized that the entire forest was silent. I have never felt fear like I did in that moment, and thankfully, fight or flight screamed at me to fly. I grabbed Matt by the back of his plate carrier and pulled him to his feet and pushed him back towards camp, screaming at him to run. I looked back then, scanning around with my light when it settled on the corpse, it was moving. I reacted purely out of fear, firing several rounds from my AR that I couldn't hear anything after that due to the deafening thunder from the rifle. I dropped my flashlight in the chaos, but the light from my muzzle showed me all I needed to see to grab my friends back at camp and rush them back to the cars. The first I remember, imprinted like a photograph in my mind, is the corpse laying on its stomach, unlike on its side when we had found it. The second, is the body resting on its forearms, the head rolling limply from the shoulders. And finally, the creature standing on its hind legs, using its clawed hands to stuff its innards back into its belly. The horrible eyes staring at me with a supernatural fire, burning with hunger. I was in tears from fear when we made it to the camp. I have no idea if any of my rounds connected. I don't know what I said or what was said by the rest of my friends when we made it into camp, but I got them out of camp and into the cars. We just drove and drove until we got to a nearby gas station which was still open. I grabbed a monster and drank it and tried to process what I had seen. There is only one thing it could have been. A true Wendigo. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Shinshin. Haunted by what I think are Wendigos. I have had a long history of paranormal shit happen to me, but these take the cake. I lived in the middle of Hicktown swamps in Georgia when these took place. When I was 13, I ran away from home for personal reasons. Booked it to a local nature trail in the middle of a wildlife reserve. I ran down it and about 15 minutes in a hand reached out from the bush to my right and hit me in the chest. I got back up and looked for my attacker, but there was nothing there. I proceeded to run home crying like a real man. When I was 15, I was laying in bed scrolling through creepypasta articles when I hear a sort of rhythmic tapping on my window. I freak the fuck out and pretend I can't hear it for a while until I can't stand it anymore and pull the curtain back. It's only a raccoon. I hit the window and scare him off and try to calm myself down. About a half an hour later, the same tapping, same rhythm, same pattern, kind of went like, click click scratch, click click scratch. So, I decide I am going to shoot the raccoon with a BB gun so he won't come back. I grab my BB gun, open the window, take aim, and there's a shadowy figure vaguely resembling a man, staring right at me. Right on the border of my lawn that connects my yard to the huge expanse of woods around my house. And it just stares at me and slowly walks into the woods behind it. After that I did not sleep for about a week. Fall, last year. On a walk down the nature trail with two of my friends, Antoine and Justin, at like 4 a.m. because we're horror movie cliches. We'd been drinking. Cracking jokes, great time. On the walk back home I feel this awful presence. I look behind me and I see something at the end of the trail in the distance. My vision isn't the best, but from what I could tell it looked like a man with a deer's head as his own. So I looked away, told my friends not to say a word until we got home. Justin knew of my past occurrences and he doesn't really fuck with paranormal stuff, so he listened and just kept walking. Now here's a list of the things I have heard/read about Wendigos and skinwalkers. They possess/steal people's bodies. You are not supposed to think or talk about them, so good luck you guys. There's an overwhelming smell of blood/sulfur when they are present. They mimic other people's movements in erratic or strange ways. They do not get social tendencies. But Antoine just looked at me for like 15 minutes while walking perfectly straight. I freaked out. Started doing the strangest movements of my arms to see if he would mimic them, and every time he would. At one point I locked both my arms and put them on my head and he did the exact same thing. I was ready to just leave him in the woods that night, honestly. Eventually he screamed something completely unintelligible and it scared the shit out of me, so I threw a punch at him and he dodged it. I apologized, told him to shut up and told them all to run home with me. When we got there we discussed what we saw and what happened, and Antoine said he completely blacked out as soon as we started walking the nature trail, only to wake up to me throwing a punch at him. About 2 months ago. This was where I drew the line. I have moved since this incident and I honestly don't plan on going back ever. I was walking down the nature trail again. Clearly I hadn't learned my lesson. Listening to music, having a good time. This thick, like permeable smell of blood hits my nose and I genuinely thought I had a nosebleed for a second until, through my headphones, I hear someone talking. I take off one of my headphones and have a look around. Nothing. Speed walking TF out of there. It happens again. This time it sounds exactly like a man screaming, "Warbringer!" Instantly, I'm on the verge of fucking tears and I jerk back, look around as fast as possible and I see it. There's a fully naked man, resembling more of a corpse than a man. With a bleeding, rotting horse's head, his arm was extended outward to me. I ran home and packed my shit. Now by this point, I have so many theories as to what happened, but I hate indulging in them. They all scare the hell out of me. My current idea is that I am just crazy. I am not sure, but, whatever the case, if there's anyone on here who has any explanation as to what any of it was, I'm very open to it. Sorry my writing skills are so bad. Edit. Probably not Wendigo's most possible options, skinwalkers, crowmacher, amdushias. Got my GF who's into Wicca to burn some sage and do some sort of protection spell, ig much about Wicca but maybe it'll help. We'll post again if anything else happens.